In the summer of 1920, on a narrow street in the financial district of Boston, a small, immaculately dressed Italian immigrant was taking in $1 million a week in cash. Not a month. A week. His clerks had run out of places to put it. They were stuffing banknotes into desk drawers, into closets, into waste paper baskets, into cupboards, because the money was arriving faster than anyone could count it, let alone deposit it. Crowds filled the street outside from early morning. Police officers invested. City officials invested. Widows brought their savings. Men mortgaged their homes. He had been in business for roughly 8 months. And in that entire time, by any honest accounting, he had never earned a single legitimate dollar of profit. Welcome to this episode of The Great Cons. Every week on this channel, we take apart one great deception, tracing not just what the con artist did, but how it actually worked, why intelligent and cautious people believed it, and what it cost the ones who did. Some of these stories are about frauds so large they reshaped the law. Others are about small, strange, brilliant deceptions that fooled experts for decades. All of them share something. At some point, somebody trusted somebody else, and that trust was the raw material the whole thing was built from. Today's story belongs to a man whose surname became a common noun. When a financial crime is described as a Ponzi scheme, in any language, in any country, in any courtroom on earth, it is named after him. He did not invent the scheme. He was not even the first person to run one in the city of Boston. But he ran it so spectacularly, so publicly, and so briefly that his name attached to the crime permanently and has never come off. This is the story of Charlse Ponzi. How a postal coupon and a genuine loophole became the most famous fraud of its era. How the whole thing collapsed in a matter of days. And the 4 warning signs that have appeared in every scheme of its kind since, including one that ran for 20 years and took $65 billion. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. Ponzi did not invent his method. He learned it by watching from someone else. He was born in 1882 in Italy, and given a name considerably longer than the one history remembers, Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi. Accounts of his birthplace differ between Lugo and Parma. His family had once had money and position, and by his childhood had lost most of it, which left him with the particular restlessness of someone raised on stories of a status the family no longer possessed. He was sent to the University of Rome La Sapienza. By his own later account, he treated it primarily as a social opportunity, spent his money on restaurants, theaters, and entertainment, and ran through his funds without completing a degree. His family, running low on both money and patience, arranged the standard solution of the era for a promising boy going nowhere. They sent him to America. In 1903, aged 21, Ponzi arrived in Boston. The line he gave a reporter decades later has become the most quoted sentence he ever spoke, that he landed in this country with $2.50 in cash and $1 million in hopes, and that those hopes never left him. It is a wonderful line. It is also worth noting how he arrived at that figure. He had boarded the ship with considerably more, and he lost most of it gambling during the crossing. What followed was a decade of drifting. He worked as a dishwasher, a waiter, a shop assistant, moving up and down the eastern seaboard. He learned English quickly and well. He was, by every account including hostile ones, immensely charming, quick, and well presented. He was also fired from at least one restaurant job for short-changing customers and for taking money that was not his. In 1907 he moved north to Montreal, and there he encountered the thing that would define his life. He took a job as a clerk at a small bank called Banco Zerassi, founded by a man named Luigi Zerassi to serve the growing community of Italian immigrants in the city. Business was booming. Zerassi was paying 6% interest on deposits at a time when the going rate was around 3%, and Italian immigrants across Montreal were moving their savings to him accordingly. Ponzi, working inside the operation, eventually worked out where that 6% was coming from. It was not coming from returns on the bank's investments, which had gone badly in Florida real estate. It was coming out of the deposits of new customers. Every time a saver walked in and handed over money, part of it went straight back out as interest to someone who had deposited earlier. That is the entire mechanism. Ponzi did not discover it independently in a flash of inspiration years later. He watched it operate at close range, for months, as an employee. He also watched it end. Zarasi's bank collapsed, and Zarasi fled to Mexico with a substantial quantity of other people's money. Ponzi, left behind and broke, went to the offices of a former Zarasi client, found a company checkbook, and wrote himself a check for $423.58, forging the signature. He was caught almost immediately. He pleaded guilty and served roughly 3 years in the St. Vincent Delaware Paul Penitentiary in Quebec. And here is a small detail that tells you a great deal about the man. He wrote to his mother in Italy, and he told her he had found a good position at the prison. He said he was working as a special assistant to the warden. Released in 1911, he went almost immediately into another criminal enterprise, smuggling Italian immigrants across the Canadian border into the United States. He was caught again, and this time served 2 years in a federal penitentiary in Atlanta. His time there gave him something. Among the inmates was Charles W. Morse, a Wall Street financier convicted of banking violations, who was in the process of engineering his own release by making himself appear gravely ill. Ponzi observed this with evident admiration. He was accumulating an education, and it was not the one his family had paid for in Rome. By 1917 he was back in Boston, apparently done with crime. He worked ordinary jobs. In 1918 he married Rose Necco, an Italian-American woman from a local family, and by all available evidence he loved her genuinely, and she loved him. He took over her father's grocery business and ran it into the ground within a couple of years. He was 37 years old, twice a convict, and a failed grocer. Then, in August of 1919, a letter arrived from Spain. It was routine business correspondence, but tucked inside the envelope was a small piece of paper Ponzi had not seen before. It was an international reply coupon. Now I want to spend real time on this, because it is the single most misunderstood part of the entire story, and the truth is far more interesting than the myth. The popular version holds that Ponzi invented a fake investment out of nothing. He did not. He found a real one. It was legal, it worked, and the profit margins on it were genuinely enormous. Here is what an international reply coupon was. If you wrote a letter to someone in another country and wanted them to be able to reply without paying for postage, you had a problem. You could not send them your own country's stamps, because those were not valid where they lived. So in 1906, the Universal Postal Union created a solution. You bought a coupon in your own country, enclosed it in your letter, and the recipient took it to their own post office and exchanged it for stamps sufficient to cover return postage. The exchange rates for those coupons were fixed by international postal treaty. And that is where the opportunity appeared, because the First World War had just ended, and the currencies of Europe had been devastated by it. The Italian lira, the German mark, the Austrian krone had all collapsed in value against the dollar. But the postal treaty rates had not been renegotiated to reflect that collapse. The consequence was straightforward arithmetic. A reply coupon purchased in Italy for the equivalent of about 1 American cent could be exchanged in the United States for stamps worth around 6 cents. That is a return of several 100% on the transaction, and there was nothing illegal about it whatsoever. This is arbitrage, exploiting a price difference for the same item in two markets, and it is a legitimate and ancient form of trade. Ponzi saw the margin immediately, and he was correct about it. The problem was everything that came after the margin. To turn that into a real business, you had to physically buy the coupons, in person, in another country at post office counters, in small quantities. You had to ship the paper across the Atlantic. You had to walk into American post offices and redeem them, in bulk. And post offices would only give you stamps. They would not give you cash. So you then had to convert an enormous volume of postage stamps into money, which meant selling them at a discount to someone, which ate a large part of your margin before you started. There were further obstacles. Postal authorities imposed limits on how many coupons any one person could redeem, precisely to prevent this. Shipping, labor, and currency conversion costs stacked up. And there was a final, insurmountable ceiling. The total number of these coupons in existence anywhere in the world was tiny, because almost nobody used them. They were a minor administrative convenience, not a commodity market. Ponzi appears to have grasped all of this quite early. There is evidence he made genuine efforts to set up a coupon operation, with agents in Europe, and that it produced almost nothing. But he had already worked out that he did not actually need the coupons to work. He only needed people to believe the coupons worked. He had learned in Montreal exactly what you could do with new deposits. In December of 1919, he founded the Securities Exchange Company, and he made an offer. Give him money, and in 45 days he would return it with 50% interest. Leave it in for 90 days, and he would double it. To understand how outrageous that was, consider what a Boston savings bank was paying at the time. Around 5% per year. Ponzi was offering 50% in 6 weeks. It is worth understanding why that offer landed when it did, because Ponzi had, without necessarily planning it, chosen an almost perfect moment. Boston in 1920 was a city full of people who had recently watched money behave strangely. The war had ended 18 months earlier. Prices had risen sharply, and ordinary savings had lost real value while sitting in the bank. Fortunes had visibly been made in wartime industry by men who had not obviously been cleverer than anyone else. The old rules about patient saving appeared, to a great many working people, to have quietly stopped applying. The city also held very large immigrant communities, particularly Italian and Irish, who had systematically poor access to mainstream finance. Banks were institutions run by other people, in another language, for other people's benefit. If you were an Italian laborer in the North End with savings under a mattress, the respectable financial system was not especially interested in you, and you knew it. Into that gap stepped a man who spoke your language, came from your country, dressed like a success, and treated you with elaborate courtesy when you walked through his door. He did not ask for collateral. He did not ask what your father did. He gave you a receipt and a handshake and a promise, and 45 days later he honored it. There is a version of this story that treats Ponzi's investors as fools. That version is wrong, and it is worth resisting, because it is exactly the assumption that makes people vulnerable. These were not stupid people. They were people acting rationally on the evidence available to them. Their neighbors had been paid, in cash, in full, repeatedly. Against that evidence, a newspaper's arithmetic about postal coupons was abstract and easy to discount. At first, almost nobody came. He raised a small amount from a handful of people, and crucially, he paid them. On time, in full, exactly as promised. That is the mechanism that does all the work, and it is worth being precise about why. Every person who was paid became a walking advertisement, and an unpaid one. They told their families. They told their neighbors. They told their priest and their barber and the men at the club. And they were not lying. They had genuinely handed over money and genuinely received far more back. Their testimony was completely sincere, which made it enormously more persuasive than any advertisement Ponzi could have bought. The growth curve that followed is almost hard to credit. In February of 1920, the company took in around $5,000. In March, around $25,000. By May, it was running at hundreds of thousands of dollars. By July of 1920, the Securities Exchange Company was taking in over $1 million a week, and on some days considerably more than that. The offices on School Street were physically overwhelmed. Ponzi hired more clerks and rented more space. Contemporary accounts describe money piled in every available container because there was no time to process it. Estimates of the total number of investors generally run to around 40,000 people, and estimates of the total taken in commonly land somewhere in the region of $15 to $20 million. Converting that into modern money is genuinely difficult, and different methods give wildly different answers. But every reasonable method puts it in the hundreds of millions. It began in Boston's Italian community, where he was a local hero, an immigrant who had made good and was sharing it. It did not stay there. It spread across the city, then across New England. Police officers invested their savings. So did clerks, teachers, shopkeepers, priests, and a number of people who worked in banking and should have known better. Some investors mortgaged their houses to put more in. Many did not withdraw at all when their 45 days elapsed. They rolled the money over, because why would you take out 50% when you could leave it and get more? That last behavior is what kept the whole structure standing. Every dollar that was reinvested rather than withdrawn was a dollar Ponzi did not have to find. And he lived the way the story required him to live. He bought a 12-room house in Lexington with a heated swimming pool and air conditioning, both genuine luxuries in 1920. He bought a custom locomobile. He wore tailored suits and carried a gold-handled cane. He brought his mother over from Italy in first class. He bought a controlling interest in a bank, the Hanover Trust, in part because he had been refused a loan there years earlier. The display was not vanity alone. It was working capital. Every person who saw the car and the house had their belief reinforced, and belief was the only thing the entire structure was resting on. Something else was happening alongside the money, and it is one of the strangest features of the case. Ponzi had become a popular hero. He was not, in the public mind of that summer, a suspicious figure being investigated. He was a local celebrity. Newspapers ran admiring profiles. Crowds cheered him in the street. He was, to a great many Bostonians and particularly to Italian immigrants, living proof that the system could be beaten by one of their own, that a man could arrive with nothing and outsmart the bankers on their own ground. He gave money to an orphanage. He was generous with staff, with tips, with anyone who asked. He also began actively buying respectability, which is a recurring feature in frauds of this scale. He acquired a controlling stake in the Hanover Trust Company, a Boston bank, using investors' money to do it. The purchase was partly practical and partly, by his own later account, personal revenge. The bank had refused him a loan in his lean years, and he took a certain satisfaction in owning it. But it also served the scheme. A man who owns a bank is not a street operator. He is a financier. Owning the Hanover Trust let him move money in ways that concealed the shortfall, and it gave the whole enterprise an institutional face. That decision multiplied the damage enormously. When the Securities Exchange Company failed, the Hanover Trust failed with it, and it was seized by the Massachusetts Banking Commissioner. Several other Boston banks that had extended him credit or held his accounts were dragged down or badly weakened. Depositors at those banks, people who had never invested a cent with Ponzi and in many cases had never heard of him, lost their savings anyway. That is a pattern worth carrying forward through this series. Large frauds rarely stay inside their own boundaries. They tend to take institutions down with them, and the people hurt worst are frequently not the ones who took the gamble. By the middle of 1920, however, the arithmetic was becoming impossible to hide from anyone who did the arithmetic. The first serious trouble came from an unexpected direction. A Boston furniture dealer named Joseph Daniels, who had supplied Ponzi with furniture on credit in the lean early days, sued him for a share of the profits, claiming he had effectively helped finance the launch. He asked for $1 million. The lawsuit was reported in the newspapers, and the effect was the exact opposite of what you might expect. Reading that somebody was suing Ponzi for $1 million persuaded the public that there must be many millions there to sue over. Investment surged. But it also drew official attention. The Massachusetts authorities and federal officials began looking at the operation, and the Boston Post, a paper with a large circulation and an appetite for a fight, began investigating seriously. The Post did something clever. It hired an expert. Clarence Barron was one of the most respected financial journalists in America, the owner of the Wall Street Journal, and the man whose name is still on Barron's magazine. He examined what Ponzi was claiming, and on the 26th of July 1920, the Post published his analysis on the front page. Barron made two devastating points, and neither required access to Ponzi's private books. The first was about the coupons. Barron calculated, from public postal data, roughly how many international reply coupons would need to be in circulation to support the returns Ponzi was paying on the sums he had taken in. The figure came to something on the order of 160 million coupons. The number actually in circulation worldwide was in the region of 27,000. The business Ponzi described could not exist, because the raw material for it did not exist. The second point was subtler, and, in some ways, worse. Barron pointed out that Ponzi was not investing his own personal fortune in his own scheme. His money was sitting in ordinary bank accounts and conventional holdings, earning ordinary rates of 5% or so. If the man running the investment genuinely believed it returned 50% in 45 days, why on earth was his own money somewhere else? The article triggered a run. Crowds gathered on School Street demanding their money back. And here Ponzi did the most remarkable thing in the entire story. He paid them. He announced that anyone who wanted their money could have it, opened the doors, and began paying out. He walked among the queues personally, calm and cheerful, and had coffee and donuts brought out and distributed to the people waiting to take their money away from him. Over about 3 days he is estimated to have paid out around $2 million. And the panic stopped. People in the queue watched others being paid without argument, decided the newspaper must be wrong, and went home with their money still invested. Some who had already withdrawn came back and put it in again. It was an extraordinary performance, and it bought him roughly a week. What finished him came from inside. Ponzi had hired a publicity agent named William McMasters, a seasoned newspaperman, to manage his press. McMasters, working from inside the offices with access to the paperwork, came to a conclusion. There were no investments. There was no coupon operation of any size. There was only money coming in and money going out. He took that conclusion to the Boston Post, which paid him for his story. On the 2nd of August 1920, the Post ran McMasters on the front page declaring that Ponzi was hopelessly insolvent, and estimating that he owed his investors at least $2 million more than he had, a figure that would prove to be a substantial underestimate. Ponzi's own publicist had publicly declared him bankrupt. Then the Post landed the second blow. Its reporters had been digging into his past, and they found Montreal. On the 11th of August, the paper published the story of his forgery conviction, complete with his prison photograph. That was the end. A federal audit of the books established that the Securities Exchange Company owed something in the order of $7 million more than it possessed. The Hanover Trust Bank was seized by state regulators. Several other banks that had been drawn into his affairs failed, and their depositors lost money too. On the 12th of August 1920, Charlse Ponzi surrendered to federal authorities. He was reportedly courteous about it. He pleaded guilty to federal mail fraud charges and was sentenced to 5 years. Released after about 3.5, he faced state larceny charges in Massachusetts. That process was messy. He acted as his own counsel with considerable skill, was acquitted at the first trial, saw the second end with a hung jury, and was finally convicted at the third and sentenced to 7 to 9 years. Released on bail pending appeal in 1925, he did the only thing he appeared to know how to do. He fled to Florida, adopted the name Charpin, and set up the Charpin Land Syndicate in the middle of the Florida land boom. He sold parcels of land, promising investors returns of 200% in 60 days. Much of the land was swamp and effectively worthless. He was indicted and convicted of fraud there in 1926. The Florida episode is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it demonstrates something important about how these men operate. Ponzi arrived in Florida in the middle of the great land boom of the mid-1920s, one of the most feverish speculative episodes in American history, when parcels of Florida land were being bought and resold sight unseen, sometimes several times in a single day, by people who had no intention of ever visiting them. It was an environment purpose-built for him. His offer was that investors could buy a small parcel and receive 200% within 60 days. The land was divided into plots so small that in some cases they were effectively unusable, and much of it was underwater or swamp. The point is this. Ponzi had been exposed on the front page of a major newspaper, convicted in federal court, imprisoned, and had his prison photograph published nationally. His name had already become a byword for fraud. He was, in 1925, the single most famous financial criminal in the United States. And he simply changed his name slightly, moved south, and started again, and people gave him money. That pattern will recur throughout this series with almost tedious regularity. Exposure does not reform these men. It relocates them. The most reliable predictor of financial fraud is prior financial fraud, which is precisely why regulators now maintain public databases of barred individuals, and precisely why checking one before handing anybody your money is worth the 10 minutes it takes. He jumped bail again. He shaved his head, grew a mustache, made his way to Texas, and signed on as a crewman aboard a merchant ship, hoping to reach Italy. He was recognized and arrested before the ship left American waters. He was returned to Massachusetts to serve out his sentence, and he served it until 1934. He was then deported to Italy. He had never taken American citizenship. Rose, who had stood by him through the trials, the prison terms, and the flight, filed for divorce in 1937. By most accounts, she had believed in his innocence for a very long time. In Italy, he tried various ventures, none successfully. He eventually secured a position with the Italian state airline, Alla Littoria, and was posted to Brazil in 1939. There are claims that he became involved in currency dealings there during the war years, and those claims should be treated with caution, since by that point a great many things were being attributed to him. What is clear is that the airline's operations were shut down as the war progressed, and he was left in Rio de Janeiro with nothing. He spent his final years in poverty, teaching English and Italian, working occasionally as an interpreter. A stroke left him partially paralyzed and largely blind. Charlse Ponzi died on the 18th of January, 1949, in the charity ward of a Rio de Janeiro hospital. He was 66. He left behind roughly $75, which was just enough to pay for his burial. Shortly before the end, he gave an interview to an American reporter, and what he said is worth quoting, because it is the closest thing to a confession he ever offered, and it is entirely without remorse. He said that even if his investors never got anything for their money, it was cheap at the price. He said that without malice aforethought he had given them the best show that was ever staged in their territory since the landing of the Pilgrims, and that it was easily worth $15 million to watch him put the thing over. His investors, over the following years, recovered somewhere around 30 cents on every dollar they had put in. That figure deserves a moment, because it is easy to hear as an accounting detail rather than as what it actually describes. Roughly 40,000 people had handed over money. A great many of them were not speculators with capital to spare. They were people who had put in their entire savings, sometimes several years of wages, and some had borrowed against their homes to put in more. Contemporary reports describe families losing everything and businesses closing. The people who did well out of the Securities Exchange Company were those who got in early, took their 50%, and walked away without reinvesting. There were some. Their gains were paid for, directly and precisely, by the losses of everyone who came after them. That is not an unfortunate side effect of the structure. That is the structure. There is an institutional aftermath to this story that usually goes untold, and it is arguably the most consequential thing Ponzi ever caused. At the time he was operating, there was no federal securities regulation in the United States. None. No Securities and Exchange Commission, no requirement to register an investment offering, no obligation to publish audited accounts, no federal body with authority to walk into an office and demand to see the books. If you wanted to take money from the public and promise them returns, you could simply do it. What existed instead was a patchwork of state laws, known as blue sky laws, so called from a judicial remark about speculators who would sell building lots in the blue sky itself. Kansas had passed the first in 1911, and other states followed. They were uneven, weakly enforced, and trivially evaded by operating across state lines. Ponzi was prosecuted not under any investment law but under the mail fraud statute, because the thing the federal government could clearly prove was that he had used the Postal Service to further a scheme to defraud. That is a telling detail. The largest financial fraud in the country at that moment had to be reached sideways through the post office. The reforms that eventually closed the gap came after the crash of 1929, not after Ponzi, and they came as the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which created the Securities and Exchange Commission. But the Ponzi case was part of the accumulating evidence that made those laws politically possible. It was cited repeatedly in the arguments for them, which sets up an uncomfortable question for later in this series. If the regulatory architecture built in the 1930s exists substantially because of frauds like this one, how did the largest scheme of the same type in history run for 2 decades inside that architecture, audited, registered, and repeatedly examined? Now, there is one more correction to make, and it matters for everything that follows in this series. Ponzi did not invent the Ponzi scheme. 40 years before him, in the very same city, a woman named Sarah Howe had run the Ladies' Deposit Company. Beginning around 1879, she offered 8% interest per month, and she accepted deposits only from unmarried women, presenting the operation as a charitable enterprise designed to protect women who had no other access to financial services. She took in a substantial sum and paid the early depositors from the deposits of the later ones. It collapsed, she was imprisoned, and on release she started a very similar operation and did it again. In 1899 in Brooklyn, William Miller, a young bookkeeper, promised 10% per week and became known in the press as 520% Miller for the annualized return that implied. He took in around $1 million before it fell apart. The structure is older still, and versions of it can be traced back centuries. So Ponzi's genuine distinction is not invention. It is scale, speed, and spectacle. He took a known mechanism, attached it to a real and verifiable arbitrage opportunity that gave it intellectual credibility, ran it in a major American city under the full glare of the press, and collapsed in under a year, having taken in a fortune. The name stuck because the story was unforgettable. And that brings us to the part of this episode that will matter in every episode after it. Strip away the coupons, and there are 4 features that appear in essentially every scheme of this kind, then and now. The first is a return that is both too high and too smooth. High returns are not in themselves impossible. What is impossible is high returns that never vary. Real investments fluctuate. They have bad months. A return that arrives at exactly the promised figure, every single period, regardless of what the wider economy is doing, is not describing an investment. It is describing a payment schedule. The second is a mechanism the investor cannot verify. Ponzi's coupons were perfect for this, because the arbitrage was real, so anyone who checked found that the underlying idea genuinely worked. What no ordinary investor could check was the scale, and the scale was where the lie lived. The plausible-sounding, hard-to-audit mechanism recurs constantly: complex option strategies, proprietary algorithms, offshore currency trading, cryptocurrency mining operations. The third is social proof doing the selling. The scheme's most effective salespeople are its own satisfied early investors, and they are not lying and not being paid. This is also why these frauds so often spread through tight-knit communities defined by shared ethnicity, religion, profession, or neighborhood, where trust is already high and a personal recommendation carries enormous weight. Ponzi started in Boston's Italian community. That pattern has repeated ever since, so consistently that it has its own name in the literature: affinity fraud. And the fourth is the one that makes collapse a certainty rather than a risk. The scheme must always grow. Since payouts come from new money, the amount of new money required rises continuously, and it rises faster than linearly. There is no version of it that stabilizes, no size at which it becomes self-sustaining, no clever management that can save it. It is not a business that might fail. It is a countdown. Ponzi's countdown ran about 8 months, which raises the obvious question, and it is the one we will take up next. If the mechanism is this well understood, if it has carried a warning label bearing a man's name since 1920, if every financial regulator in the world knows exactly what it looks like, then how did a respected former chairman of the Nasdaq stock market, operating from an office in Manhattan, with audited paperwork and the confidence of banks, charities, universities, and some of the wealthiest people alive, run one for what investigators later estimated at around 20 years, and taken $65 billion? Charlse Ponzi lasted 8 months and died with $75 to his name. Bernie Madoff lasted until the world's financial system itself collapsed around him and dragged his scheme out into the light. That is the next episode. Thank you for watching. If this was worth your time, please give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment below telling us which con, fraud, or forgery you think we should take apart next, because there are a great many of them, and we intend to get through as many as we can.